The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz along with Dan Rylance, and we're joined this evening by two members of the Oshkosh Common Council, gentleman in his second term, Bain, and our former co-host here on the show, Tony Palmeri, who's currently in his first term. I should say right off the bat that we were originally planning to have County Executive Mark Harris here. However, with some of the developments recently in the city, we made a quick change the day before the show's taping, and we want to thank Mark for being kind enough and flexible enough to say he'd come at a later date, and we want to thank Tony and Bryan for being flexible enough to be able to be here this evening. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Obviously, the very first issue, which kind of prompted this whole schedule change, is that of the city manager. Just to kind of set the stage for viewers, in case they don't know, the 100 block, which is Ben Ganther's project, along with his partners, that has not only been in arrears as far as taxes go on a pretty consistent basis, but we learned last week that the property has been foreclosed on due to his failure to pay $6.1 million in principal, interest, and so forth. So the bank has foreclosed on he and his partners in this project, or they're in foreclosure proceedings. The city's been named as a defendant in that lawsuit, and it's in a TIF district. The kicker to the whole thing is the city knew about it, the city manager and Jackson Kinney knew about it on Monday of last week. You guys had a council meeting on Tuesday. It was not brought to the council's attention until you received your packets on Friday. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. However, Frank Tower apparently was just told a little tidbit about this on Tuesday.
That's what I've
either
heard.
Before or after the council meeting is what we understand from the paper. And because of that, citizens are up in arms about it. The council members are up in arms about it. Tell us why you're upset.
Well, I'll start from a perspective of historical perspective. The previous council has had conversations and discussions with the city manager and about the city manager in regards to information flow to the council. And one of the things that we set out there and tried to be very clear about is, even if you don't know the whole story about something, tell us what you know, and then tell us that more information is coming. But don't surprise us. We don't want to read about it in the newspaper. We don't want to call from a reporter having our first knowledge of that information. We just tell us, put it out there, get it out to us, and then do the investigation and follow up, and then give us more information later. But we should know earlier rather than later.
And when did you all tell him that?
We had conversations, I believe, I don't know if it was the, I think maybe right around the first contract or evaluation processes. We were talking about some expectations of knowledge and information, and actually we saw some improvements with that. We got a couple of emails. One in particular was the Mercy issue. There was some discussion about not having knowledge about Ben Ganther being involved in the new Mercy project, and we got an email saying, hey, just so you know, this information's out there. You may get phone calls. We didn't intend to keep it from you, but they sent something out. They got it to us.
But it came after the meeting. But it came after the meeting, right. So that doesn't count, Bryan.
No. I'm not defending. I'm not defending. But there were some examples of where they tried to be out there, but realistically, on major stuff, especially something like the 100 block, which is, you say the phrase, and there's very few people in Oshkosh who probably are not going to have some sort of reaction one way or another.
Okay.
That needed to come to us.
Okay. Well, Tony, you're one of the new people on the council. Obviously, you didn't take part in some of that stuff. What is your feeling on what's gone on?
Anybody who was awake during the campaign season knew that the themes of
everyone's campaign were openness, accountability, transparency, especially as regards economic development projects. So for the manager to sit on this information is really outrageous. And I suspect that's why Councilor McHugh has called for a closed executive session to discuss the performance of the city manager.
And that, for the public's information, will be coming on the evening of the 24th after the regular council meeting, and that will be one day after this show airs for the first time. I know the Northwestern said, Bryan, that you're calling for Richard Wollank's removal. However, in talking before the show, you've clarified that they got that somewhat twisted around, I guess.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain exactly what you're trying to accomplish?
I think the blurb that they put on the website made this impression that I'm out there beating my chest saying he needs to resign today, immediately. And that's not what I'm doing. I relayed a conversation that I had with the city manager, and I told him to his face in April that I felt like he was a good person, but I just felt like his leadership style was not what the city needed anymore, and I felt like we needed to go in a different direction. So I personally felt it's time, and I still do today feel like it's time for a change in leadership. That was then construed into I'm calling for his resignation today, and that's not what I'm doing. I think we have to have some conversations as a council first on what are we going to do, what's going to be the process. If we are going to remove the city manager, what's the next steps? We need to have some plans in place before we start going down that road.
Sure, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple minutes. I know that one thing that the city manager said in the newspaper was that the reason that they didn't bring this to the council's attention was because it had just happened. He wanted to be able to get more information and include it in your packets on Friday. And as a taxpayer, I'm sitting back thinking, you know what, that's a bunch of BS, because you may be wanting to still do that. And you still can do that, but you can at least still say, hey guys and Miss King, you know, we've got a situation here. Here's what it is. We're going to try and find out more information for you, and we'll put it in your packet on Friday. Don't just keep everyone in the dark.
At that Tuesday meeting, Cheryl, we were voting on two major downtown projects, the convention center and the access group, the waterfront proposal. Someone in City Hall, either Mr. Wollangk, Mr. Kinney, or someone else, I believe, realized that if we'd had that information, it would have had an effect on the discussion of the convention center and the waterfront. Would the votes have changed? I have no idea. But it seems to me there was an intentional withholding of that information so as not to influence those discussions. And I think that's very unfortunate.
You're both saying tonight, though, that Wollank's job is on the line. Is that?
I think us going into closed session to discuss his performance is completely appropriate. Absolutely.
Yeah. Tony, you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think all options have to be on the table. And quite frankly, Dan, I would be shocked if Mr. Wollangk has not known for a long time that his job is on the line. I mean, how else could he have interpreted last year's set of goals? I mean,
What goals?
I think, well, right. I mean, the fact that last year's city council went into closed session 4 or 5 times to discuss the city manager's performance and came out with these goals. I mean, unless Mr. Wollangk is willfully blind, and I don't think he is, he had to know there was an incredible amount of discontent in those closed sessions. I wasn't there, but I assume there had to be. So I hope that no one thinks that this is fresh and new. I think that Mr. Wollangk has had to know for a while that the push for accountability has been in place. And this, whatever anyone thinks about this current Common Council, I think the one thing we've proven since April is that this is not a business as usual Common Council, and everybody up there, I believe, is asking tough, pointed questions. And Dick has to know that he's been in trouble for a while.
Well, then, is enough enough? Or are you going to give him another chance and say, in the future, we want you to do that? Or are you saying, this is a repeated thing?
Yeah.
You know, where are you guys at? Yeah. Is this enough, or we're going to give you another
list? For me, and maybe I'm just naive on this point, we're taping on July 19th. Our next meeting is on the Tuesday.
Right.
I still think Mr. Wollangk has time to step out front and announce some major changes in the way things are done at City Hall. Do I expect him to do that? No. I'm still holding out the possibility that he may finally step out and lead and announce some major moves that will demonstrate he's committed to openness, transparency, accountability. Whether that means shifting personnel, he has the power to do that. The Common Council, correct me if I'm wrong, Bryan, cannot do anything with department heads.
We only hire and fire and supervise the city manager.
Now, am I saying that Dick Wollangk should come out and fire someone? He should do something. Otherwise, I think we are put in a position where we all ran on accountability, we all ran on transparency. If we don't see any leadership from our manager in that direction, what options do we have?
You know, though, I find your statement sort of interesting because you've been asking for Dick Wollangk to give leadership for as long as I've known you.
Yeah.
So now you're going to give him another chance to demonstrate leadership? How many chances does he get?
Well, that's a good point. But maybe, who knows, maybe in this flurry of press accounts in the last few hours, maybe this will finally be what it takes to get him to that point. I don't know.
I want to go back.
I guess what I'm saying, Dan, is I don't want to close the door on anything.
Right.
And when we do get into executive session, I think all options have to be on the table, and I'm sure Bryan agrees with that.
You know, I want to go back, Tony, to something that you said, that once the goals came down, you know, the city council met several times last year to discuss goals and so forth, and the city manager's performance. But from those meetings, and no disrespect to you or anyone else on the council, Bryan, but they were some pretty vanilla goals, and you know that yourself because you and I both sat at this table and criticized those goals. They really had no teeth to them, no initiative to them. Anybody can put up a couple suggestion boxes. Anybody can have someone in the IT department redo a website. Some of this stuff he's farmed out. They were underly ambitious goals. How would he have derived from those goals that you guys wanted more accountability? Yeah, he read it in the paper, he heard it, but if it's not put on paper for the man, he's not going to do it.
My view from the outside was, if I'm the city manager of a city and the 7 councilors are engaging in this highly public discussion of the fact that I need goals, when my predecessor, Mr. Free, no one ever talked about setting goals for Bill, I think that Dick had to look at that and say, the fact that this process is going on demonstrates discontent.
I don't think he looked at it that way, though.
Apparently not, because I do agree with you. I think the goals were weak in the long run. But if he was not, I'm just trying to put myself in his shoes and think, how would I feel if the Common Council has gone into 3, 4, 5 closed sessions to set goals for me? I would say to myself, I can't believe they're sitting in that room talking about how great I am. There must be other discussions going on there. So if he didn't have a sense that something was going on, then I think that does call into question a lot of judgment issues.
Well,
and just to comment on the goals too, and Tony hasn't been in on one of the processes of setting those goals.
True.
It gets pretty difficult when you try to get 7 people who want 7 different things to agree on a set of goals. And so what was there was agreed upon. Could have been approved? Absolutely. There were some things that I advocated for that didn't get on there, just like other council members. And some of the things that I think that were probably the ones that were more task-oriented were responsive to what we heard from citizens. We want a better application process on the web. All right, that's going to be a goal for the city manager. We need to get that done. Some of it too, when you're doing supervision, you want to try to build some momentum, and so you try to put some things out there that says, once you get some things going and you start moving in a direction, maybe that will, kind of have the snowball effect, that bigger and better things will continue to happen. And unfortunately, that didn't catch. So there were some intentions behind that, and it is a difficult process. And quite honestly, there were 7 different perspectives going into that meeting, and it was extremely difficult trying to corral us in. I kind of referred to us as the 7-headed supervisor, the 7-headed beast, trying to corral us into one focus.
of course, other cities have
yeah, absolutely.
And
I don't know how many times
a makeup
they have
of
goals
a number
and what they set up.
of council people, and they're able to come up with real task-oriented and beyond goals, and I think that's what we need. And it just seems, I like Dick Wollangk as a person. I'm not sure how I feel about his job as a city manager. I think no one knows the city probably better than him. I agree with the Oshkosh Northwestern on that point. But this just seems, there is too much secrecy in City Hall, and it goes on, and it never seems to end. So if you guys discuss his performance, as you will on Tuesday night, will that, do you think, lead to a discussion of his removal or his termination?
There's question as to whether we can legally have that discussion without another open meeting.
Correct.
Notice.
I asked the city attorney today about that, and from my conversation from him, the premise for the closed meeting that Councilmember McHugh is asking for is to discuss the performance. And with open meetings, to be able to go to a closed meeting, we can only cite paragraph C. Okay. If we wanted to actually have a discussion and vote on a contract of on termination, that would actually have to be noticed as a separate type of notice, a closed session notice, paragraph B.
And occur at a different time.
Well, it can occur at the same time, but it has to be noticed as we're doing two separate things. The other function of that is apparently if we do want to talk about termination, there is an option in there, I guess, in the law that allows Richard to have a say in whether or not he wants to have this open or closed. Okay. So there's, I think, some legality issues there as well. And according to the city attorney, he explained this to Councilmember McHugh, and Councilmember McHugh has asked for the discussion of the performance only at this point. So that's what, I guess that's where we're limited to as of this taping for
Could
next
you
Tuesday's
amend
meeting.
that at the Tuesday night council meeting?
Given the issue we've had in the past with regards to notices and how they may or may not have been as clear, I'm not sure that that would be in the best interest of the city to do that. I think it would be better to have a special meeting to do it.
What are you going to share with the public after the closed meeting? You guys are both, Tony in particular, against, I mean, are you going to come out and tell us what happened in that meeting? Are you going to offer something to the public about what this thing that keeps festering, or is it going to be all quiet and you can't say anything?
Well, I'll go back to what I said during the campaign. Is I said then we needed some different leadership in city in city government. So I'm not going to say what I specifically told Richard.
Sure.
But I will tell you the generality is what I said today. That I told him that I felt he's a great guy, like you said, Cheryl, passionate about the city, knowledgeable about the city. I just think leadership-wise, we he served us well for 10 years. It's time to move on to a different leadership person in that leadership position.
Could you not amend that open meetings notice or closed meetings notice right now to possibly include or dovetail a possible discussion of termination should it lead to that? Just to cover yourselves? I mean, put them both on there.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't
Otherwise
understand.
It's wasting time.
Yeah, I don't understand the whole piece of where Richard gets involved in that and what say he has. So I don't know what I don't know what issues that brings about if we want to do that. So it would have to take a phone call to the city attorney and further discussion.
He'll go into his magic little ball
Yeah,
and he'll say this and this.
My understanding is that another attorney has been consulted. I don't know if by the mayor or by another council member, so that we'll have at least two sources of legal advice. It may be that we need a discussion of the performance just to find out how to go about doing the termination meeting.
If it would lead to termination at some point, I know in talking with people the last few days, one of the concerns that a lot of citizens that I've talked to have is, how would the council go about this if you're going to terminate him? Would we go city managerless for a while? I mean, I can't see that's in our best interest. What process would you take? How do you guys envision this?
My guess would be that the city council would appoint an interim manager, and then we would begin the process of a national search. Do you agree with that?
Yeah,
process?
and I asked again. That was another question I had for the city attorney today. Was what happens if we go down that road? And it all depends on what we actually say. If we terminate the city manager and say, we don't want you to serve, there's a clause in this contract that does call for a 6-month severance if we terminate his contract early. Now there is some language we were discussing before. If there's some performance issues that he's not living up to, maybe or maybe not that 6 month, but let's say it's there, that 6-month clause is there. We could ask him to serve that 6 months. We could say, we're just going to give you the pay for the 6 months and not have you serve. He could choose either or. Yeah, I'll serve the next 6 months, I'll get you through the budget and I'll leave, or I'm going to clean my desk today and be done. We have the power to appoint an interim city manager for up to 6 months. And if we need someone longer than that, we can reappoint someone or appoint someone new for another up to 6 month term. So those are some of the things, and I think that's why I question the process stuff. Those are conversations we need to have. And according to the city attorney, those are conversations we can't have in closed session. We would actually have to have those conversations in open session. So planning for the future, if we decide to go down the road of termination or resignation on the part of the city manager, then we have to start talking about what are we going to do post, Richard Wollangk in that position.
Cheryl's point is well taken. If you need to find an interim person, and that's really part of the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to get back to 100 Block. What's the potential economic loss or the liability to the city? What's the worst case scenario and what's the best case scenario? I have a hard time figuring that out, to be honest with you.
Well, I guess the TIF becomes insolvent, and the city, then taxpayers, are on the hook.
Okay.
That, I believe, is the worst case scenario.
And that's
now, the fact, however, that the city has also been named as a defendant in this lawsuit suggests to me that the consequences could be even worse. I don't know if Bryan has, I still haven't had time to completely research the consequences for us, but I suspect taxpayers are going to be on the hook for quite a bit of money at this point.
Yeah, and there's some discussions regarding the foreclosure process and wanting to sell the property, and there's an issue of a minimum real estate tax payment of about $330,000 that there was some personal guarantees and some guarantees by Mr. Ganther and Mr. Niebauer that they would pay. Now there's a question on whether that would come in, and is that going to be able to cover our city debt service that was gone through the developers agreement, developers assistant grant. So that, I think, is another issue, is what happens to that bonding issue and that indebtedness that we have as a city. And they're currently exploring the legal issues of, can we take Mr. Ganther or Mr. Niebauer to court to get that money to be able to cover our bonding.
Do you have a sheet yet from the city as to the alternatives of how bad that would be?
No, we did get a memo.
We got a memo, and it pointed out 4 things that they are looking at exploring, and I would assume we were going to be getting more information here the next week.
Very general explanations.
Explain to folks, guys, why the city has been named as a defendant in this lawsuit.
I believe from what I've gathered from the memo is that because of the developer's assistant, or the agreement we signed with them, because it's a TIF district and we provided an assistance grant, that the city was essentially a part of the project, therefore a co-defendant, if you will.
And that makes sense. And I think that's even more reason why we need these pay-as-you-go TIFs, which I heard no one in this city talking about pay-as-you-go TIFs until I brought it up when I ran for council 2 years ago. Now all of a sudden everyone is talking about them, and I think that they're a good idea because they do limit the city's risk, and they do put the developer more on the hook for the project and its future. And
you'll be happy to know then, Cheryl, in Jackson's memo to the council, he says, and I quote, "In the future, the department will not recommend anything but pay-go bonds in response to the developer request because of this situation."
I mean, 6 years ago, those of us who were critical of the way we use TIF were literally referred to as communists, and now all of a sudden we'll go with pay-go TIF. And by the way, I don't know enough about pay-go TIF yet. I don't think anybody really does, but I think we need more analysis of those also, because remember, TIF is only supposed to be created if development would not take place without it. If a developer is able to go pay-go, it opens up the question of, well, maybe a TIF
isn't the way to go.
Right. I mean, if your project is that viable that you're going to be able to go pay-go TIF with no problem, that suggests maybe the TIF isn't necessary. Now, I don't know. I haven't had enough opportunity yet to research pay-go and how it's been used in other places. But suffice it to say, the 100 block, I think, is going to push us into doing more research. And actually, one of the good goals that were set for the city manager, and I know Bryan agrees with this, was he has to provide an end-of-year report on the progress of our TIF districts, on all of them. And I'm hoping, I mean, again, we don't know what the leadership is going to be, but if that report were to be simply Mr. Kinney giving us this optimistic, upbeat, glowing report on our TIF, that's not acceptable. I mean, we need something much more transparent than that.
Well, but has that been clearly spelled out?
I don't know.
You know, just like, has it been spelled out in writing for Mr. Wollangk that you want information disclosed as soon as he gets it, rather than withholding it until he's got all the dots connected? Has that been put in writing to him?
I can't tell you what the goals say because I don't have it in front of me, but I know in conversation the intent was that we wanted to see a report based on where are we at with funding, you know, is it performing, is it not performing, how many years do we have left to pay off, you know, how much do we have to pay off. That's the information we want. We don't want an editorial about our TIFs. We want data about our TIFs.
Correct.
And that's what we've asked for.
And has the requirement for more information up front, has that been put in writing to him?
You know, I don't know that that was ever made in a writing goal.
That could be a problem.
Well, it could be, but you know, in some respects, though, too, I'm not sure it should be. I think that would be a pretty general expectation that the council wants to be kept in the loop, unless really you've lived in a different city for the last, I don't know,
but
3
when
years.
you deal in today's litigious society, and you have a manager who does not seem to do anything above and beyond what he's asked for. Maybe he does, but I don't think we as a citizenry can see it. Then I think just, you know, when you're dealing with contracts and you're dealing with big dollar numbers like we are with his salary, I think it's always good to spell things out in writing. And that way everybody's clear, everybody's on the same page, and no one can come back later and say, you never said that. This, of course, Tony, as you mentioned, this ties in with the riverfront development and access acquisition. Now, Councilor McHugh is wanting to bring back the master development term sheet for access that was approved at last week's council meeting. The Oshkosh Northwestern opined this way in their recent editorial: yes, the building is blocks away from the waterfront's turf. Yes, the two projects have different developers, but what better time was there to invite Oshkosh's elected leaders to ask frank, fair questions about the city's in-house redevelopment efforts? Last week's deliberations represented an incredibly germane juncture. And I think that's true. Now, of course, he voted in the majority, so someone else in the majority, he'll make a motion to bring this back. Someone else who voted for that term sheet, and Tony, you didn't.
I did not. No.
So someone else will have to vote to second his motion.
Actually,
anyone can second.
Anyone
Oh, is that right?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Only
I'll second
person
it.
on the prevailing side has to make
Correct.
the motion.
So it
Correct.
just has to be someone on the
Correct.
majority
That's right.
to
Correct.
sponsor it.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, well then this
Okay,
will
he'll
come
get it.
back.
He'll get a second. Yeah.
And the other muddle in the Northwestern story is that some of the council members said they wanted to discuss it. A motion to reconsider by any parliamentary rule is totally non-debatable. You cannot discuss a motion to reconsider. And so if anyone pulls that, you know,
So the motion to reconsider has to pass by a majority before we can actually discuss.
then you discuss it.
All right,
Correct.
okay.
You cannot discuss the reasons for the reconsideration in the motion.
Right. Okay.
That's really important because
It is.
it's two different stages.
It is.
You reconsider, you bring it back, you talk
Right.
about it. You move to reconsider and it's not reconsidered, it's over with.
And Dan, that brings up we had an issue with the liquor ordinances with the Cranky Pat situation where you cannot debate a motion to waive the rules.
Yep.
And so I've asked the city attorney what we can do, and he said all we have to do is propose parliamentary rule changes.
Okay.
And so you will see on the next agenda, I'm going to have parliamentary rule changes
Okay.
to allow for debate where it says in Robert's rules we can't, because I
Okay.
think it does no one any good not to talk about why we're wanting to do something.
So
That's
you want to
silly.
change the rules so you can discuss a reconsideration motion?
Absolutely. I mean, how else are you supposed to know? Because legally, we can't talk to each other outside the meeting. So how else are we supposed to know why a person wants to reconsider something?
But that's what you're going to talk about if you make the motion to reconsider. Why do you have to know?
I think you need to know ahead of time what someone's thinking, because depending on what that person brings forward, I may or may not support a reconsideration
But then you vote the reconsideration down.
without knowing why they want to bring it forward.
Yeah.
So then we have less information.
You guys are quoted as saying you're probably not going to support it. I think you're mixing the two different sides. Just personal opinion.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to disagree on
Yeah,
that.
that's fine. Yeah. But a motion
Well,
to reconsider is
yeah.
bring it back,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we do vote to reconsider, because I think the discussion needs to be heard. I mean, I can't speak for Dennis McHugh, but
Sure.
I suspect what he's thinking is, if I'd had this information that was kept from us, maybe that would have changed my vote.
Right.
Because, again, just like with the 100 block, we're dealing with a term sheet
Right.
that was written by the same cast of characters. And even though Jess King and Bryan and others really asked some outstanding questions about that term sheet, I think there's a school of thought that says we ought to give it another close look. And only reconsideration will allow us to do that, I believe. So I'm hoping that the council does vote to reconsider.
Councilman Hugh, he's going to be busy on Tuesday night, isn't he? Is the Cottonwood
It
issue
is.
coming
Yeah,
up?
Cottonwood
The Cottonwood tree ban issue.
is.
We'll talk about that for just a moment. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
just to go. You know, it's only the female cottonwood tree that provides the cotton. So, you know, if you're going to do it, you should only, you know, let the male cottonwood tree go on and only go after the female.
Well, then
cottonwood
there's a
tree.
sex discrimination.
Well, that's what I
issue.
want.
This issue needs almost
Okay.
minimal conversation.
Yeah,
at the
I don't think
council
it's going to be
Okay.
a lengthy discussion.
And for viewers'
Yeah,
edification,
this is a break.
Mr.
Yeah.
McHugh, this is a little bit of levity. At least we seem to think it is.
Yeah.
Mr. McHugh is bringing forth, has already brought forth, you know, an ordinance
Yeah.
that he's proposing to ban cottonwood trees, new trees being planted in the city. It's, I think, ridiculous, and you guys apparently think it is too. So that's a good thing.
Excuse my break, but I
No
just thought that
problem.
was
Well, I understand people being annoyed by certain types of trees,
Right.
but I mean, obviously, it ought to be more of an educational effort than a
Yeah.
Yeah.
strong arm of government.
Well, I'm annoyed by shoveling sidewalks. I'm
Right,
annoyed by
exactly.
snow. What
Yeah.
what will we do
Exactly.
about that?
Right.
We could outlaw
You know,
snow.
Yeah,
Outlaw,
that would be
yeah.
great. A global warming type
Yep.
thing. That,
Oh boy.
anything else on the city manager or access?
No, but I'd like to get to Miller's Bay before we
Okay.
end up.
Can I just comment
you
real
bet.
quickly on,
Sure.
on access? I think we have to be somewhat careful too, because we're dealing with a business here who has nothing to do with the 100 block, and we don't want to create the situation where you know, it's bad to do business here in the city because we're going to chastise you or hold you responsible for other bad developments that have taken place.
Sure.
So I mean, I think there may be some fault on the city's part, and I think there, if you read the memo from Jackson, it sounds like the reality is, from his mind anyway, we're not going to do those types of TIFs anymore because it, you know, it lends itself for being more open to issue. But we have to be real careful here because I don't want to create a situation where we're constantly revisiting every term sheet we do. I think that sends a really, really bad message about the city.
No, but I do think that Councilor McHugh is right here in that, you know, he may have asked different questions. Everyone, a lot of people on the council may have asked different questions had they had this information. It's just like had they had the information that Ben Ganther had ties to the group developing and at that time proposing to redevelop the Old Mercy Medical Center property, other questions might have been asked. And, you know, absent that information, you don't ask certain questions. And I think that, you know, in the interest of total openness and full disclosure, I think that it should be discussed. And
I agree.
you know, those other questions, at least he be given and others be given the opportunity to ask those questions. It just seems right to me. Go ahead.
For the past year, the only issue on Miller's Bay has been whether the Outer Street Fishing Pier was going to go in or wasn't going to go in. Pitted the city and the DNR and the park against some homeowners with a lawyer, and it's finally been resolved that I guess the pier is going to go in. Kind of quietly last week, the Miller's Bay 1000 was sprayed for weeds. There was no public notice that I know of. No public comment from either the Outer Street Fishing Club, who might have been concerned about fish, or the residents on Menominee Drive, who might have been worried about possible infection or something from it. Sort of the same theme, again, no notification that we've been talking about earlier on 100 block. Same theme, maybe a minor. Stu Rickman opined that this was great because this was a partnership between the yacht club and the city. There was a report on the spraying, but there was no comment on the chemicals at all. What's your response to that, and do you know which two chemicals were used in Miller's Bay, and if they did have any environmental adverse effect?
I don't know the answers to any of those questions. I mean, I was surprised that there was no notice. I mean, all of us, excuse me, on the council had information presented to us by a citizen, Charles Basics, about the processes that could be used to get rid of these weeds. We had names of chemicals mentioned. I can't remember what the names were.
I've got two of them, but I can't pronounce them.
But I'm pretty sure everybody on that council was under the assumption that before the spraying would take place, there would at least be something brought before the council that would say this is what we're going to do. I don't know why that didn't happen. And I want to believe that the Parks Department operated in a way that is perfectly legal, but still, does that mean it was the right thing to do, especially in this environment of calls for openness and transparency? I mean, clearly something needed to be done with Miller's Bay. Something does need to be done. But yeah, I could see why people would be very concerned that we now have chemicals sprayed and we don't know what they are and how we got to that point.
And I think this kind of went back to think it was January Parks Board meeting where Dr. Lazat from the university came in and talked about the issue, and that's where it really started.
You were on that committee.
That was on the, I was on the Parks Board at that time, and so it's been something that I've been talking to Mr. Stefani about. What are we doing with the weeds? What kind of plan are we going to have? Where are we going with this? Then recently we got the packet of information from the citizen, a very hefty packet of information from him, and then at that point the yacht club stepped forward and said that they would be willing to partner with the city in working on some chemical, and some of the information, depending on what you read, chemical was the way to go. That harvesting wouldn't affect it. Would be
it was like cutting your lawn.
Cutting your lawn.
We've done harvesting,
right? And it was far more expensive of an issue, and quite honestly, the Parks Department didn't have the funding to do that. So,
can I just ask, Brian, the harvesting was never really announced to the public before it was done.
I don't know.
Right, I don't think it was. So my guess is that Mr. Stefani, the Parks Director, probably assumes, perhaps correctly, that he has control over how to handle this weed problem.
Right.
I mean, he did the harvesting without a public call, and then it made sense to do the weeds.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I don't know how it did. Why it didn't come out, or should it have come out? I'm not sure. I think one thing that we can say, and we talked about this Tuesday night, was the need for some sort of waterways board or committee or commission, and that's something the council agreed, you know, based on that Parks Board experience that I had brought forward, saying, you know, we should really probably bring the partners together: Yacht Club, Otter Street, DNR, UWO Biology, citizens, and bring them together and have somebody looking out for our waterways. That could be a vehicle for, okay, we have a weed problem, this would be the proper board to be dealing with it, not necessarily the Parks Board who's dealing with the parks. Yes, it's a park, it's in a park, but is it a park issue or is it more of a water issue? And I think it's more of a water issue.
Do you think the Parks Director, though, ought to share this in a public notice, just like we've been talking earlier about the city manager sharing public about 100 block?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had some issues in the past with the parks, you know, with regards to noticing when projects are going to take place, and they've made some taken some steps to place to say, okay, if it's this type of project, we're going to notify this big, and if it's this time, it's this big. You know, this should have fallen right in line with that.
Just another example.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, and just another example, I mean, this weed problem was actually brought to the attention of the Parks Department and just sort of brushed off. This particular citizen was just sort of brushed off. Tony, you mentioned his name. I can't think of it.
Mr. Basics, Charles Basics.
Yeah, he's a boater, and so that forced him to do research on how to, you know, abate the problem and how to get the DNR involved and that kind of thing. He went to the media, and after all was said and done, then, you know, the two parties, the yacht club and the city, came together and they got it taken care of. But, you know, should the city just be kind of shrugging people off? I mean, Tony, you and I had to file a huge complaint with the Attorney General's office. You and Dan and some others, you know, tried to sit in on a closed session meeting. Others have gone to the Attorney General's office. Should it be incumbent upon citizens to continue to force this city's department heads to do their jobs, to do them with respect for the citizens, and sometimes to listen to the citizens, because sometimes we do know what in the world we're talking about? I mean, isn't this just more of the same kind of problem that we're seeing with our city manager right now?
Yeah, I think it is. Now, Basics, the citizen, I think, had become more and more belligerent in the tone of his emails and in his contacts with
you know,
Tom.
If you're put off.
Right, and that's really what it boils down to. And I think that the department heads need to understand that, yes, citizens will start to get belligerent if they feel that they're being put off. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Well, and I don't think it's out of the question for someone to come to the council if they've gone through staff and felt like that they didn't get any progress. I mean, that should be, you know, I appreciate that. Absolutely,
absolutely.
Yeah, and, you know, the reality is, even if the issue was funding, you know, there's a way to go about saying, I understand your concerns, I'm hearing your concerns right now, the city doesn't have the funding to do it, we'll explore it when we have the opportunity. There's a way to handle it, and I don't know how it was handled, I have no idea. I think there's some history there as well, but I'm not sure.
Right.
Okay.
Two other issues have come up last week, and just reaction preliminary to them. One is the Northwestern calling for a Blue Ribbon Commission, investors for downtown, riverfront, and central development. And the other one is a early proposal of a $10 million revamp of the museum. Initial reactions to either one of those?
Well, the museum project, from my understanding, it would be all fundraising effort on their part. It wouldn't be necessarily a city project where the tax dollars are going into it. It sounds fairly ambitious. It sounds like it would be the largest one the largest fundraising expedition in the city in its history.
When the group out by EA has raised $2 million for the other
correct,
museum, right?
Correct. So I'm wondering, maybe this was the pie in the sky,
Sure.
and there's some other plans out there, and they're feeling how this is getting reception, and maybe they go to Plan B, or maybe this is really what they want, and they're going to work hard to do it. And if they can get it on their own, great.
Sure.
I really don't want to see the museum closed for 2 years.
Yeah,
that was part of
a
it.
concern.
Yeah. And part of that said that there's need to build storage space, and I don't know. I'm thinking there's lots of places in town to store things, so I want to look more into this. We do have a lot of empty building space in this city. Now, I don't know the logistics of transporting museum materials, but maybe again, like you say, it's self-generated funds here, but maybe they don't need to build storage space. I mean, we don't know. As for the Northwestern Economic Development Commission, I'm glad they're on board with something like that. Let's not forget the Northwestern was the biggest cheerleader for the 100 block. And it would have been, and back then, Cheryl will remember, there were many of us in the community calling for that kind of thing at that point. So I am happy to see that they're on board.
Want to bring up sidewalk issues. We just did a show with Miles McGuire and Mayor Tower on this. Now, Tony, you supported the sidewalks on River Mill based on the issue of safety, and yet when Miles was here, he brought some pictures showing other areas of town, and he put a whole lot more on his blog of different areas of town where the traffic is heavier, the safety is more of a problem, and yet there are no sidewalks. He also, just this week, posted something on his blog using your business as usual test in the sidewalk case. And he wrote, here's how Tony described business as usual. Limited public input, limited public buy-in, questionable financing and or planning. I'm still quoting him here. According to Tony, quote, challenging or putting an end to business as usual was one of the main themes of the campaign season, and pretty much every candidate said that BAU, business as usual, was unacceptable. And then we're back to Miles' quote here. It doesn't seem to have worked out that way in my neighborhood, and that makes it hard for me to see how this council will deal with the bigger issues before them, such as the waterfront and 100 North Main. How would you respond to that?
First of all, is this how I used to sound when I was sitting in that?
Yes, very much so.
Well, first of all, my business as usual comments related to economic development in the city. I said I'm going to evaluate economic development proposals according to these business as usual standards. But even with River Mill, people can support or not support what the council did. It certainly was not business as usual. Business as usual was to leave River Mill alone, even though everyone has known for at least 15, probably 20 years, that it fits the subdivision ordinance and that sidewalks should be there. Safety, I mean, Miles on his blog posted some of my comments from the initial meeting in which we discussed this, but I noticed that my lecture, as Dan referred to it, didn't make it onto his blog, perhaps because the lecture was not as easy to take apart. In the lecture, I said, yes, it's safety, but it's also an issue of we have a subdivision ordinance in place. And even though this subdivision was platted before the subdivision was in place, all the homes were built afterwards. And so in a very real sense, River Mill has been on a list for 20 years. To say that we need another 5 years for the subdivision, I mean, it calls into question, when would you be able to do any subdivision?
Is it the responsibility, though, of a single counselor to bring forth a resolution ordering in sidewalks?
My understanding is that that counselor you're talking about had several times in the past years asked for it to be put in the sidewalk program. And the Department of, Mr. Patek's department, Public Works, and the city manager did not do it. Now, I personally spoke to Mr. Wollangk and Mr. Patek, and they both said they want to see sidewalks in River Mill, but they were not going to bring it forward. And so if I don't know why. They had no explanation as to why not. If that's the case, I don't know what option the council has. Now, if
it's safety, though, Tony, shouldn't they have gone in other areas that were less safe first?
We're talking about subdivisions. In fact,
well, we're talking about safety, though.
Well,
that was the underlying issue why this was brought forward was safety.
Most subdivisions have much less traffic than River Mill, because most subdivisions, actually all subdivisions, do not have the Wyowash Trail. I mean, it's interesting to listen to Miles, because on the one hand, he's saying on your show, no one comes to River Mill. But then a sentence later, well, people do come by with their cars to go to the trail and do walk in to go to the trail. Well, which is it? Either there's no one coming into River Mill or they are coming into River Mill. Clearly there are. There are people coming in to use the trail. And my philosophy is that when the only means to travel for people, cars, rollerbladers, bicyclists is a street, that is a safety issue. Does that mean that people are going to be killed today? No. But it's clear, if we just compare subdivisions, and that's how I'm looking at River Mill, which is what it is, River Mill has the most safety issues because it has the trail. So should we say to other subdivisions in town, since you have even less traffic than River Mill, you should be able to either remove your sidewalks or never have them? And I will say that Bryan, and correct me if I'm wrong, he claims that sidewalks for River Mill are a progressive thing, but he simply believed that we ought to look at it in the bigger picture. So, Cheryl, I don't think that what the council did was improper in that sense.
Will we be seeing more of these issues then brought forward by individual councilors to order in sidewalk in some of the other areas?
We might.
Okay.
I mean,
because I think if that's the way we're going to go, if that's the road we're going down, or the sidewalk we're going down, then that's what we should continue to see.
The issue for me is whether our ordinances mean anything. I mean, we have a subdivision ordinance that clearly applied to River Mill. The city administration, for whatever reason, did not want to budge on it. So in that sense, either the council says, okay, even though the ordinance is in place, we won't budge on it. That's business as usual. When, as we've been saying, if your leadership won't lead, it's left to the council to do it. Now, I understand why Miles and other people in River Mill are upset. Nobody wants to pay a sidewalk assessment.
I don't think that's their issue.
Nobody wants
that's
to.
Not their issue.
Nobody,
it's the process.
Nobody wants to shovel snow.
That's
I understand
not
this.
their issue. He said it's the process.
But my belief is we are in a city. Everybody has the right to walk the city safely, and that includes every subdivision. If we want to do with River Mill to say, all right, we'll make this exemption, how then do we ever have sidewalks anywhere?
I understand, Tony, and all I'm saying is it's about the process. You brought up about them not wanting to shovel, that's not the issue, and he sat right here and said that wasn't the issue. It's the process.
Are you willing to agree then that every subdivision should have 20 years before sidewalks are installed?
No, I'm not willing to agree to that, but I think that if we're going to order in sidewalks on the basis of safety, then we should be putting them where people are, where there's more safety issues.
Well,
and what about the city? They've got a city park. He showed a picture of a city park that had no sidewalks abutting it. What's the story with that? Then if we're going to do that, Tony, then let's do it.
Yeah.
And let's make people safe all over, not just in a subdivision.
I agree with that.
Let's make them safe all over.
I agree with that.
So let's start ordering them in.
I agree with that. But I would also say, I think that when a subdivision has had many years, to say give us 2, 3, I mean, what's interesting is Miles has been saying he agrees that sidewalks are needed there, just not now. So, all right, after 25 years? And then what I don't understand is why doesn't every part of town get that? Because any place you try to put sidewalks in any city, people will come forward and say,
they will, yes.
There's no traffic, no one's ever been hurt, no one's ever been harmed. You're then back to the ordinance we had from 76 to 86, where the council then had these lengthy, contentious meetings. Mr. Kraft talked to us about our meeting, and what was the end result? The council usually ended up not putting sidewalks. So I understand that people are upset, but I don't know what other process we had in this case.
Okay. But I did like your idea, Bryan, about at least waiting and trying to complete the whole picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Congress Avenue, Summit Avenue area, clearly we're going to have sidewalks and trailway from Wisconsin Street Bridge up to the River Mill or River View Apartments or whatever they're called, and then nothing until we get into River Mill, and that concerns me. And so I think, if I have no issue with council members bringing things forward. I think we have to do it from a bigger picture piece of it, though, and not kind of leapfrog it. Right. I think that makes more sense.
And my point at the meeting was that bigger picture discussion is fine, but it brings us back to the 76-86 ordinance. Maybe the council wants that, but I think we ought to have an up or down vote on it, because the big picture may have concluded that, all right, in this big picture, we decide that it's perfectly okay for people to use the street in River Mill. Well, at that point, for every other sidewalk project, we no longer can just assume they're going to be installed. We have to have a big picture discussion.
Well, my plan would have had the sidewalks in River Mill. It just would have been on
well, but I think
up to a 3 year.
But I think you
timeline.
I think you did acknowledge there was a scenario in which they may not be there, depending on what the big picture found.
Oh, I said we should look at what the citizens had brought forward with, utilizing some of the street in that area as walking bike path. But I'm fine with a sidewalk being everywhere in the city. Okay. I said that then.
Yeah.
Try this. Yeah. I was surprised on your vote on the sidewalks in River Mill Road, and I'm kind of surprised at your stridentness in defending your vote. I remember you running as saying, I want neighborhood input if I get on the Common Council. I want neighbors to come to the council. Well, damn it, they all came, and you totally blew them off. You didn't listen to one of them, and you had a prepared speech the second time, your lecture, as to why they should accept it. I'm saying, well, there's Tony the candidate, and there's Tony the councilman, and they're not together in this issue.
Do you believe, Dan, that listening means agreeing?
Well, I think when everyone from a neighborhood comes and
first of all, it was not everyone from the neighborhood.
Damn near.
Secondly, the arguments have been laid out in numerous other venues before that meeting. Blogs, phone calls, emails, other letters. The arguments were there.
But you don't care about that neighborhood because you didn't listen to them, really.
I don't care. I bike through that neighborhood more frequently probably than anybody at this table. I care very much about it.
Okay.
In fact, I care about it so much that I believe everybody ought to have access to it. Okay. I know it's always great to look at the world from the perspective of someone who doesn't need a sidewalk. But believe it or not, there are people in this city who want to be able to walk to that trail and don't want to have to walk in the street to do it. I begged some of those people to come to the council and speak, and they wouldn't. They don't want to come forward. But not everybody is fully able-bodied and youthful and can go out into that trail and feel comfortable doing it. We have to be concerned with people like that too. Now, does that mean if sidewalks go in there, there's going to be now a glut of people coming in to go to the trail? Probably not. Will there be more people going to the trail? Yes, definitely.
I'm not sure that that's true. But, able-bodied people, what about, there was a gentleman in a wheelchair who, I don't remember the particulars on this, but he had given some information to Councilor King, I guess, that he couldn't use a certain area because there were no sidewalks.
Road, wasn't it?
Yeah. North
I mean, now there's a classic case of someone in a wheelchair who needs to get from point A to point B and can't because there's no sidewalk. What do we do about that?
Right. And we actually put together a plan where we're going to look at getting access on one side of Main Street all the way out to Snell.
Why not on both sides?
I don't.
Because
I have no
we
idea.
could have just done one side of sidewalks here on River Mill Road too.
Right.
And here again, why is there going to be a plan put together for that? And this got pushed through just like that.
But Cheryl, it didn't get pushed through.
I think it did,
This
Tony.
has been known about for years and years and years.
This was sponsored by Councilman Esslinger. He brought it forward after one gentleman spoke at a council meeting.
No, he'd been talking about it for years before that.
He may have been talking about it, but certainly not in the public that we heard. One gentleman brought it forward, and you yourself at a council meeting, Tony, said in his defense that he brought it forward because a gentleman at a previous meeting had asked about it.
Well, he should be here defending himself, but he also said that he'd been requesting in several previous councils that it be put in the program. Now, I don't know, maybe Bryan has advice.
And he maybe did.
What is a councilor supposed to do when you've requested something 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times and it doesn't happen? It's supposed to do nothing? I mean, yeah, I could see why ordering in sidewalks, but what option? If you ask for it to be done, and the public works director and the manager agree that they should be in, but for some reason they won't bring it forward.
I understand, and that's fine, but I guess the issue is he was focused on one particular street. And I think that's where this idea between where the Northwestern proposed that it was a political type thing between he and John Delantonia was at the center of this, and the reason for it. Because he didn't, he talked a good game about safety, but he was not concerned about safety in other areas. If he was, he would have brought forward other streets along with River Mill. Instead, he brought forward just River Mill the first time around. Other things got added, but it was just River Mill Road the first time.
Well, again, I'm not going to defend him, so.
Well, yeah, and that's fine. Smoking ban revision. We're down to about 3.5 minutes here, but there's an ordinance change coming before the council at your next meeting. Again, this is from Councilman Esslinger and Mayor Tower. It would weaken the smoking ban as it presently is on the books. You know, how do you guys feel about that? How do you plan to vote on that?
Well, I asked for some clarification, and essentially any facility, if it requires a new occupancy permit, would fall under this change, which essentially, instead of going 90 days smoke-free and then proving that you should be allowed to smoke, it reverses that. If this were to pass, it would say you have 90 days to smoke, and then you need to prove that you can continue to smoke. So my biggest frustration with this is when we have, let's say, a TGI Fridays wants to build out on frontage road of Highway 41. Clearly a restaurant, clearly not going to fall under this exemption of being allowed to have smoking, of being a tavern. It's a restaurant. But yet they would get to have 90 days of smoking before they would have to then say, oh, now we're not all smoke-free, even though we just smoked up the joint for 90 days. To me, that's silly. I think it bypasses what the citizens voted for. And I won't support it.
Okay.
Tony?
I'm torn on this one because the gentleman who came forward, it's clear that he's going to have smoking after 90 days. He's not going to be declared a restaurant. He's selling sandwiches and pizzas. So in those 90 days, he's really at a competitive disadvantage with other taverns. Having said that, I think if a city council is going to tinker with an ordinance that was brought forward through referendum, it has to be something pretty urgent and extreme. And I'm not sure that what Mr. Berger, who's a great guy, by the way, and I hope people actually visit his place on Harrison Street, that area needs economic development.
He's the one who came before the council, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I think when you're in small business, you got to be prepared to make it through your first 90 days and assume everything's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
So, but again, the key thing for me is that we want to tinker with something that the voters put in place. Unlike the Cranky Pat situation, where what we were reforming there was a law that was put in place by the council many years ago and was possibly outdated.
So you're both are leaning against it.
I'm leaning against it at this point.
Yeah. And the reality is the voters did approve an ordinance that allowed an exemption.
Right.
So if there was a way to somehow bring forward a change that would allow those clearly meeting the exemption to go ahead and smoke 90 days and then prove that they should continue, I would at least consider that. But when it encompasses the places that clearly are not going to will not be able to allow smoking in 90 days, and then have them smoke for 90 days is just silly.
Okay, excellent. We are just about out of time. I just want to clarify one thing here. When we did have Miles McGuire and Frank Tower on the show, we had said that we were going to ask Frank Tower about why the crews were out there.
We can ask them.
Well, no, we don't have time for that, but I've got the answer.
You have the answer.
Good. We found out from the city manager and from Mayor Tower that and we just completely forgot. We ran out of time, and that was it. But I did post it on the website, and the reason that the crews were out there right away after that first initial vote and not the formal one was because they needed to do the work anyway at some point, and it had never been done out there as far as the survey work goes. And so Mr. Wollangk said, based upon a 5-2 vote, that was a clear indication that sidewalks were wanted there. So they did the work, and it just saved time later. So that's it in a nutshell. So thanks, guys, for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you both very much.
And we'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on